David, you've spoken about the unique cybersecurity challenges of non-human entities, including smart contracts and automated transaction engines. What do most teams still misunderstand about security and these kinds of systems at scale?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when organizations think of non-human identities, I think the proper way to look at them is functionally they're no different than, say, a full-time employee. These are different processes, tasks, agentic agents, if you will, that are all doing different functions, whether it's operational work, whether it's work, from a front end, to deliver, anything to a client. And you should be building and thinking about the same proper guardrails that you put in place for your employees that you put in place for these non-human identities. So, for example, if you have the concept of zero standing privileges for your employees, which is, I don't want to say it's a new concept, but it's as Gartner likes to throw around new buzzwords in order to make some money on some of their research. Zero standing privileges is really the concept of something that we've been doing for the last 30, 40, 50 years, which is least privileges, and the most least privileges you can have is no privileges. So the concept of zero standing privileges of I don't have access until I need it. And then at that particular moment in time, I determine whether or not this thing, whether it's a person or it's a non-human identity, should have access into that thing. I will then look at the context of what they're asking for, and then we'll grant that process or person. So you should be treating your non-human identities just like you would an employee who has zero standing privileges. The other thing too is to think about zero standing privileges, non-human identities, just like you would as an insider. So your insider threat program should be looking at these processes or agents as identities and should be thinking through them through the lens of insider threats as well.
Awesome. And what do you think today's dominant security model in crypto, so audits plus on-chain monitoring, is still fundamentally missing?
I don't think we have enough time to go through everything that's missing, but I think, if I want to boil this down to what the problem is today, I think the problem today is a lot of organizations think that's enough in the sense of let me outsource or transfer my security responsibility to a third-party firm. If that third-party firm comes back and gives me the thumbs up, everything else is great. So there's a couple of fallacies in that line of thinking. First off is audits are, number one, a point in time. Audits are not a silver bullet that catches every single possible vulnerability. It may catch most of the knowns and may not catch unknown vulnerabilities. There's a reason why we have the term zero-day vulnerability, meaning we haven't seen it yet. So something that was audited in January, there may be a zero-day vulnerability that is exploited the day after your audit is performed, and there might not be any change to the code base. Audits also expire. I've seen some shops will, not shops, audit shops, but I've seen, organizations or projects will send me an audit report and it's 12, 18 months old, 24 months old. These things should be constantly refreshed. And the other thing is audits really should be like your last thing that you do. When I was working for an auditing firm, a lot of organizations would get upset if there was nothing found or there was no criticals or high founds, but that should be the goal. You should have such a great internal program, which includes CI/CD, internal SAS scanning, DAS scanning, everything that you can possibly do in order to identify those vulnerabilities before it hits the auditor. And if the auditor gives you a thumbs up, we found nothing, you should be happy that your internal security program and processes are working. So I think, it's really borrowing like a page out of the book from non-Web3 organizations that have been doing this for the past 20, 30 years, following this framework, understanding how their information security programs are set up. Again, if you want to bucketize them, there's preventative controls and there's also detective controls, and they both should have many, many layers to them. So you want to prevent as much as you possibly can throughout the entire process. If my code doesn't have any vulnerabilities, let me shift left and say, well, can one of my internal developers inject something into that code base when they're pushing something new? So you keep shifting left. And then again, assuming all of your preventative controls are working properly, they may not. That's why you have detective controls in place. You have circuit breakers in place. So it's really understanding the entire threat landscape and making sure you have the proper controls in place.
And if you were designing a ideal security stack for digital assets from scratch today, what are the kind of, when you're talking about these buckets, what are maybe the buckets that you would be trying to fill if you were building out this ideal stack?
I'd probably start with threat modeling. I think it's something that a lot of organizations don't do because as engineers, we tend to think we know the answer to the problem before actually doing our own investigation. But I would say it really is advantageous to stop and really understand from a threat modeling perspective, what are the bad things that can happen and how can they happen? And then you develop your controls. So I don't think it's an answer of these are the things that you should be doing. There's obviously things, internal infrastructure security. There's, whether you're using YubiKeys or whether you're doing, data loss prevention. Like there's tons of things that like everybody knows we should be doing, but we want to start thinking about the Web3 specific threats. It really comes down to threat modeling. It's thinking through who has the keys to update a contract? Where are those keys stored? Is it self-custody? Is it with us? Is it with a custody provider? What are the controls in place to review code before it hits production? What controls are in place to prevent unauthorized code from hitting production? So there's tons, and again, that's where the threat model will help organizations understand if one of my employees was owned. Could that ownership of that employee lead towards something malicious getting injected into one of our production repos?
Mhm. And how do you view LLM-based security tools versus deterministic methods or formal methods when it comes to proactive smart contract security?
Great question. I think every organization should be doing both. I think LLMs are fantastic from force multipliers. You have the ability to do so much more with I don't want to say with nothing, but with much less resources, if you will. With the proper prompts and the proper models with the right knowledge sets, LLMs can effectively be almost, I don't want to say your entire security team, but it can really take a team of 3 to 5 and make them appear to be a team of 20 to 30, folks. Because again, you have, different agents, and I would build out these agents as I would a particular employee. I wouldn't just, YOLO my instructions into a large model and just say, go do blank. I would purposely build a model or an agent that's specifically a pen tester. I'd build an agent that's specifically, looking at source code, an agent that's specifically doing this, and have them all function independently of each other with the proper guardrails, with the proper access into the right information. So I think that's the right approach to think about LLMs. And then from a deterministic perspective, formal verification is something that I'm a big advocate for. We really want to think through how can we prove mathematically that this is going to react and behave in the manner in which that we expect it to. And that's where we can build in that proper monitoring to say, has anything deviated from a behavioral perspective? Because when we start thinking through security threats, there's, let me hack and exploit a vulnerability. But then there's the behavioral things. Is it behaving the way that it should? Has somebody found an exploit from a business logic perspective? And that's where formal verification and unit testing and those things can really help organizations really think through, have I properly thought through how can somebody exploit from a business logic perspective?
You spoke about your belief that teams should leverage both LLMs and kind of deterministic formal methods type security methodologies or tools. Where have you seen the kind of benefits and drawbacks of the traditional tools or traditional methods that teams have used on both sides of that spectrum? And where have you seen kind of the security landscape evolve in digital assets?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, if you take like formal verification as an example, I think it's probably the most critical in Web3 in the sense of, to break it down for the listeners, at a very high level, formal verification is a mathematical guarantee or certainty that your application is running as you had designed it. And as we know within Web3, due to the immutability of transactions and irreversibility, and the fact that these things are bare assets, it is so critically important that we get these things right when we are launching contracts. So, I'll touch on the LLM in a second, but when you think about formal verification, the proper way to think about it is like we're developing these guardrails to say like it should behave, when I say like the highway, like this is what we're expecting. We're not expecting the car to flip over the rails and start going downhill and doing something that we're completely unexpected, that we don't have any controls over or any oversight. So with formal verification, you're able to say, like as an example, this balance should never be lower than this balance. And then from formal verification, we're able to prove out mathematically that the code that we have written will never, create an instance where that truth, is not true. And I think, from my experience, I think things like formal verification, while understood, are so difficult to implement for many organizations because it touches on not just security, but it touches on math. And, I think it's something that I don't say it's the holy grail because like in some respect from a security perspective, like we can't always prove every single possible contingency, but there are certain non-negotiables that we should be able to prove when it comes to formal verification. So I think it's going to be increasingly important, as more organizations really truly understand what formal verification is and how to properly implement it. It has been difficult in the past, and there are many tools today, that are helping organizations realize the benefit of formal verification. And then on the LLM probabilistic side, that's also as critically important, because as these LLMs learn and as they evolve over time and understand vulnerabilities and understand threat vectors, organizations will be able to implement this much earlier in the process and being able to identify those vulnerabilities before you go live. Identifying things post live, like with an audit report or through bug bounty programs, while that's great, the problem is you're already live. You now have a process in which you need to update, code that's live, that's in production, which can cause more issues. There's downtime. You're now accessing live code, which could be used as an opportunity to inject. So for organizations, the best place to catch things is before you implement, and those things are done through things like LLM probabilistic, testing, as well as that formal verification guardrails.
And the final course, so because this is a security table, we want your final course, your security hot take. What is one belief you have about digital asset security or security at large that you think most of the industry is still getting wrong?
I think the answer or the thought of I'll fix it later, I think is still very much prevalent in Web3 security. And I don't necessarily blame some projects in this thinking. It's just a matter of how these organizations evolve over time. If you look at, most of these organizations start out with pre-seed funding, or they're bootstrapping. So they're not necessarily going out and they're not hiring CISOs, they're not hiring security engineers. They're taking their existing engineers and saying, well, you're technical, so therefore, build out security. And that's what I think is probably one of the biggest dangers is, engineers are not security people and security people are not engineers. We all do things differently. If you ask a security engineer to be a full-on developer, you're going to get, part of my language, like, a really shitty production quality application. And the vice, is true in the sense of you ask an engineer to build out security, they haven't lived what we live and they don't see what we see. They're not going to be thinking through all those contingencies that we do. So really think through properly building out a security program from the beginning foundationally, because it's really, really hard to, quote, fix it later. I'm a big analogy person, and I would say same thing if you're building a house. You don't build a house and then say, I'm going to worry about building a bathroom later. You have to build the pipes first before you put up the drywall. So that way, you can understand later, I may want to build a bathroom here. It's the same thing with security. You can't just start ripping things open and start, laying down a new foundation for certain things.
Amazing. Thank you.
Of course.